We're live. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Reminder that instead of the This Is Not Therapy Hour, we're doing the Effective Artistry podcast. And I just wanted to make a quick announcement before we go that my wife is pregnant with our third child. We're very excited, and the due date is coming soon. So from now on, I am keeping my phone on. And if it's my wife calling or texting, I will answer and duck out. So if there's any noise from that, I apologize. And that at some point in the future, there will be a week, most likely, where I miss, hopefully just one. But we'll figure that out, and let's go. Yeah.
All right. Well, hi and welcome, everybody. My name is Mike Wang, and I'm the head of school over at Fusion Academy. It's located in Oak Brook, Illinois. It's just outside of Chicago on the west side. And we are a private school we specialize in serving kids in a one-to-one model of instruction, and we work with both neurodivergent and neurotypical kids. Welcome to our fourth episode of season 2 of Effective Artistry. Executive Functioning and the Neurodivergent Mind, featuring Brandon Tessers, LCPC. Before we get started, a reminder, today's stream will be recorded and rebroadcast in podcast form, and you can find that podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We're currently streaming on Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube, so make sure that you keep those chat boxes full wherever they are on the platform that you're using. If there's any things that you want us to talk more about or less about, or just something completely random pops in your mind that you think would be interesting to add, we want to keep you engaged. So I'll help moderate and read questions as they come in. Today we have a very special guest on the stream, Vanessa Castaneda-Gill. She is the CEO and founder of the social emotional learning platform Social Cipher. She has a background in neuroscience, tech, and research. And today we're diving into the topic of discovering identity through video games. And now, with all the introductions out of the way, it's my pleasure to give the floor to our featured guests and hosts, Brandon Tessers and Vanessa Castaneda-Gill.
Hi, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Vanessa, for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I really am excited to have you here too. Vanessa and I, we haven't known each other very long, but we've had a couple conversations. I got to see Social Cipher, the demo of the game that Vanessa's company is building. So we've been talking a little bit and just have a lot of overlap in focus on neurodiversity and neurodivergent individuals and new and different paradigms and modalities to be able to support them. So maybe we could start off, Vanessa, if you could just give us a kind of a overview of what it is that you do, what Social Cipher is doing, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, super happy to. So Social Cipher is a social emotional learning platform that uses space-powered adventure games to help neurodivergent youth and the professionals who work with them learn social emotional concepts. Started this based on my own experiences on the spectrum, which we will definitely get into, I'm guessing, in this. Our games contain narrative and narrative stories, characters that are truly created through the voices of the neurodivergent community. We co-develop with hundreds of neurodivergent youth and professionals. And that's really how we come up with these things and how the magic happens with us.
Great. Yeah. And really, I've seen it in action. Maybe we should put up at the top, is there some place for people to go if they want to learn more or see more instead of just having it described to them?
Most definitely. So you can go to socialciphergame.com, and that's Cipher with an I. But honestly, if you Google Social Cipher, it'll come up. Everyone gets it mixed up all the time.
And you might also get the result coming back of Vanessa being, what was it, one of the 30 under 30? Forbes' 30
yes.
under 30? Something like that. Just got to embarrass you right off the top. When we were talking, we always have these pre-meetings for these things to explore topics. And of course, people want to hear about video games, and we wanted to talk in that direction. But Vanessa, when you and I were talking before, you had mentioned how you came to this, and as you just did, kind of, that phrase, came by it honestly. I don't really totally know what that phrase is supposed to mean, but, like that it is a natural outgrowth of you and your life and your experiences. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that, about you as an individual and how you came to this work and what you do, why you do
Yeah, can do. So, yeah, it started when I found out that I had autism and ADHD when I was 14. And for me, as a young woman on the spectrum, as someone that had, limited resources and had a lot going on in their life, I kind of succumbed to all the stereotypes. And that was really what I had to fall back on. And stereotypes of autism are not ideal, especially for young women and girls. And so I had a really difficult time with things. I felt like social connection and connecting with other people just was never going to be possible for me. I felt like I was just broken and that was how I was going to stay. So I decided I'd just neatly cut off the emotional part of my life and the whole idea of connecting with people, because if I couldn't do it, then why even try? And of course, you can't do that. But 14-year-old me thought I could. And that resulted in years of mental health issues. So for 6 years, I hid my diagnosis. I was so ashamed of it. I also fell into some really bad difficulties with low self-esteem and anxiety and depression. And really, it wasn't until later on, probably in my early 20s, that I started realizing that there were ways that I could learn. And so I started kind of taking the things that made sense to me. So for me, that was music and movies and games and the stories within those, and realizing that I could kind of map them out into my own sort of social emotional roadmap and figure out how things worked that way. And from that point on, I realized, oh, I'm not a broken person. I'm not a bad person or an undeserving, annoying person. I am just different and I just learn differently, and that's fine. And so then I, of course, was absolutely intrigued by the brain. And I went to college. I became a neuroscience researcher for 4 years. I published, and I looked back at all the things I had done and how far I'd come both academically and also socially. And I thought to myself, well, what about all these other young people that are probably struggling with self-esteem issues like I was? And that's how I started Social Cipher, and brought on my closest friends, and they were the very first people to learn about my diagnosis. And yeah, the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, I so appreciate you being willing and able to share on that level of detail, because, and I'm sure you've got a lot of practice at this point, but because there's so many people who share those things and it's just not discussed very commonly.
Right.
Especially when we're talking about autism, which we'll probably focus in more on today as a specific, subset of neurodivergence, because that's your background and your experience. That we rely generally, culturally, not we, those of us here, but culturally, like you're talking about, rely on all these tropes and myths about autistic people are like this and are like that. And, in particular, one very prominent autism researcher that I won't name today that, proposed the male brain theory, and that autistic people have very male brains. Autistic people like to categorize things like that. So I can only imagine what it's like to experience that kind of messaging and what it might take to kind of overcome it. And you gave it to us just there in kind of an overview terms, but especially with talking about video games and Social Cipher, maybe you could give us a bit of detail of what in that journey, what in that process, what about it has been helpful for you or was interesting and helpful for you?
Yeah. So I think that when we first started Social Cipher, I had no idea how to make games, and I knew how to lab. That's what I knew how to do. And so I was like, all right, well, we're just going to make this a lab simulation where you put on an EEG headset. I got all into different types of neural waves that I was studying already, and realized that wasn't actually going to be fun and engaging and something that people would want to do. And so then my team and I were kind of like, all right, what about VR? VR is new and cool and maybe something that would actually immerse you, like, very literally. And we were in that space for a bit. We had a couple of reasons for not doing it. One of them was that none of us were VR developers and knew anything about how to do that. The other was that just at that point, especially, VR was just not going to be accessible to the people that I wanted to get to. And also from a sensory perspective, it wasn't going to be the best for folks. And so we finally ended up getting onto games as sort of the main idea there. And that's where I realized that, and I was sort of against that at first, because I was like, okay, fine, games, but how are we going to do this? Like, how are we actually going to immerse people in this? And I think that one thing that I still had in the back of my mind, and the reason why I was going towards more of these like sort of like very immersive, sort of almost clinical methods, was because for a while, even though I thought I was quote unquote better, I was still thinking of this as a way to fix my former self, or to fix my younger self. And I was also, yes, trying to help young people like me not have to face the pain that I faced, but I was going about it in the wrong way. In that I was trying to just make sure that they would fit in as much as possible and be as quote unquote normal as possible, so that they didn't get the bullying and didn't get the low self-esteem. But that also was not the right way to go. And I figured that out as soon as we started creating the narrative of these games, because I was all inspired by our first playtester, named Ava, and that's what the game is called, and that's who our main character is. And I remember playing with her, and she hated our first prototypes, by the way. It was pretty hilarious. I drew comic pages. I made a PowerPoint and tried to make it into a game, and she got so frustrated. We finally hit gold with a puppet show, and she was okay with that. So that was great. But I remember that I just, throughout every one of these playtesting sessions, I kept seeing her and being like, do I want her to have to conform like I was trying to do? Is that really the right way to go about this? Of course, I don't want her to have the self-hatred and thoughts that I had, but I don't know if this is the right way to do it. And as I started writing, there are much more talented writers on the Social Cipher team than I am. But in the very beginning, I was writing the stories because I was the one that had to, pitch all this to get people on my team and to get funding. And I was writing this story of, I knew I wanted a female protagonist. I knew I wanted her to be Ava. And I kept stopping because I was just like, oh, I don't want her to continue to realize that she has to conform and be normal. I wanted her to take pride and have confidence and embrace her identity, and really just step into who she is. And I was doing that at the same time with Social Cipher. I had immense imposter syndrome. I was at that point, I was like in my senior year and had just gotten out of college and got into this really fantastic incubator in DC. And I was the youngest one. I was the most inexperienced one. And I was just like, I was out here. It was all focused on social interaction and networking and all things that I had just never done and never thought I was good at. And so in that same time, I was trying to conform, and I was like, wait, this is not working for me. I need to make my own ways to help myself thrive if I'm going to survive in here. And that's kind of what I started realizing with Ava. And so we were kind of going through this same journey as these narrative iterations were happening. And as, my iterations on who I was and how I presented myself were happening too. And I realized that, it was about, embracing who you are in the moment and trying to find the resources and support that work for you.
Yeah, I love that. And I love, and I'm going to call it out by name, discussing ABA and kind of, and people do it differently, but generally speaking, ABA, not generally speaking, universally speaking, ABA aims at the wrong goal, right?
Yeah.
To be able to increase people's ability to mask and pass as non-neurodivergent. But what I like is that you didn't throw that away, right? It's not that you shifted from I have to fix myself because I'm broken to I'm perfect and don't need to work or change or develop anything. It's about presenting yourself, or now through this platform, presenting people with more information.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just saying you should make eye contact, you say some people will consider that if you don't make eye contact, you don't respect them, or that you're not listening to them. Not as a should or should not, but as in here's data for you. And of course, a lot of us neurodivergent people want to ask those questions about why and what's,
Oh yeah.
But the more you understand like the purpose of things, because you're talking about, having a hard time with networking, but the way that you and I met was literally somebody on your team set up a meeting for us, found Effective Artistry in this space. And we just had like a cold meeting, you and I, And it was a fantastic meeting. I had a great time. So you can work on developing those abilities with, or especially if you separate it from the idea of this is the right way to be or the correct way to be. It's an option that I have. It costs me a certain amount to do it, but sometimes it's worth doing that instead of being, whatever my default option is.
Exactly. And I think along with that, it's also about it's also about not fitting in with everyone and realizing that is okay, if not encouraged, honestly. Like knowing who the right people are for you, knowing who you're going to click with and who, there are people that are out there that are not worth your time and energy, and like that was a very hard lesson for me to learn. And I think that's incredibly important to learn too, because I think it's especially for me after so many years of being socially rejected or bullied and not realizing this until years after, I felt like I had to compensate for it, and I felt like I had to get everyone to like me, and that that goes to another extreme that's also not very good. So it's about advocating for yourself, being just vulnerable enough to be able to show people that, hey, this is who I am. This is what we need to work together on, or you and I need to do in order to kind of work with that. Like, will you take that or will you not? And if not, like, good for you, not for me, right?
Thank you. Hey, Brandon, you mentioned ABA. Can you tell us, our audience members, a little bit about what ABA is? And then Vanessa, if you could just tell us a little bit about what Social Cipher does in comparison to sort of traditional pathways of treatment.
Sure.
ABA is applied behavioral analysis. So it's a methodology primarily for working with, autistic individuals, and in the United States and I believe the UK, but in a lot of places it's the dominant paradigm and often the only one that insurance will cover. But there are better or worse methods of applying it. And some people do very monstrous and abusive things. And most autistic adults that you talk to who have been through ABA will describe it in those terms. But the goal, regardless of how they're doing it, the goal is the wrong goal. It's behavior modification. It's like Vanessa was talking about. This is the right way to act, teaching you how to be normal. So I use eye contact as an example because it's a very common one with autistic people. Of course, not universal, but that eye contact can be uncomfortable, painful even, for various reasons, and we can all have theories why. But in ABA, you are incentivized to engage in eye contact or even punished if you break it without looking at the purpose of it. So many autistic people don't do well with eye contact because they are so sensitive and perceptive to social data that when I'm looking at you while I'm speaking, I don't have enough room in my awareness to really hear and understand what you're saying. I am so overwhelmed by that. It's kind of like a sensory sensitivity, except it's social data is not a sensory category. So what you're actually end up doing the exact opposite of what you intended by convincing or rewarding or whatever people into making eye contact more. They're actually hearing you less. You're just training them to be more tolerant of their discomfort, instead of, like what Vanessa, you're saying, helping people to explore and understand what things work for them instead of making them better able to pretend to be different than they are.
Yeah, precisely. I would say for us, it's definitely more about choice and figuring out what works for you. It's about, using the things that are within your power and that are within your, zone of being able to thrive, and trying to figure those out in a safe, sort of accessible way, that, doesn't have judgment or rejection or a need for masking, right? Like, for example, in one of our quests within our game, because so Ava is our episodic series. It's all about, each of the episodes covers a different social emotional competency. And this first one is all about trust. And that's, building trust, detecting trustworthy or untrustworthy relationships. And for us, it's not about telling each player exactly who is untrustworthy and who isn't. We hint at it. We will show different, character traits of each of the people that Ava, our main character pirate, is trying to recruit. But we finally give the player the choice of who they want to recruit, who they feel like feels good to them. And they work with the consequences, or they work back just like in real life. And that is completely their choice. And in one of our last quests of the first episode, we have this non-speaking character named Leor, and Leor communicates using a sort of an space pirate iPad, I would say. And they're also non-binary, so they use different drawings to communicate. And that's just a different way of doing it. And as Ava, you can either choose to kind of continue with them and understand how they explore and process and work through the world. Or you can actually just choose to reject them and deal with the consequences. But instead of, the mission being trying to get Leor to talk or trying to get Leor to communicate with you in the way that you want to be, that most people communicate. It's about sort of making compromises and working with Leor because you believe that they're a genuine and cool person to work with, and working with other folks' communication styles.
I love that. And I'll just quickly, because I mentioned ABA throughout AAC, which is part of what you guys are referencing there with that character, I'm assuming, which I'm blanking. It's something adaptive communication. What's the first A in AAC? Anyway, something adaptive communication. The idea being that not everyone communicates in the same way. So non-speaking autistic people, that doesn't mean that they don't or can't communicate. It means that they are not speaking. And non-speaking autistic people will sometimes speak later in life or speak under some contexts and not in others. But using things like tablets and other types of technology to be able to help people to communicate in ways that work for them. So to bring it back to video games, like you were just getting into, that's the lead. Everybody's here to talk about video games, right? Because we were talking last week about the performing arts with Annie Calhoun and talking about that balance of safety and challenge, right? That so identity exploration is a process. You have to try things to see how they impact you, see what you like, see what fits, see how other people respond to things. But that's hard to do when you don't feel safe. In fact, I would say impossible, especially if you've experienced bullying and rejection on that scale, as opposed to rejection of, hey, you seem cool, but we're not a good fit. The kind of rejection that causes harm. Augmentative and alternative communication. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, chat. Try not to use names in the chat since it's going to be recorded. So one of the things I find so fascinating about Social Cipher is we talk a lot about language here, using the language of video games. That there are things in the experience of gaming that are translated one game to the next, right? So that you can build, just like what we're trying to do here, you can build on this language that the people playing your game already presumably speak in order to be able to get into other things. So I'll bring up the character of Redbraid as a particular example, which I love, by the way, Redbraid instead of Redbeard because they're pirates. And maybe you could talk a bit about Redbraid and how you're utilizing that kind of language of video games, video game tropes, in order to kind of speak to the player in a more complex way.
For sure. So Redbraid is kind of our mentor, counselor stand-in within the game. She is really sort of Ava's guide, Ava's cheerleader, and also very importantly, for the first episode, which is all focused on trust, is, a model of a trustworthy, respectful relationship, right? And so Redbraid is sort of the one to be reassuring. And we add all these extra dialogue options into the game, right? I think in a lot of role-playing games, you make a decision and it's like, okay, go. But, we add a player's potential need for more endurance or, hints or nuances of a player being like, well, maybe I'm not totally sure how to do this yet. We add sort of those anxieties or those extra needs to show that like it's okay to ask for that reassurance and that there is someone there to kind of support you and help you through that. And we also think that nuance is just super important because a lot of the time in real life, especially as a neurodivergent person, you don't just make a decision and you're just like, all right, sure, I know exactly what to do. I have no anxieties about this. And we wanted to make it as true to real life as possible and have someone there to support that. And that really is who Redbraid is in this game. And Redbraid is also kind of like a role model for Ava, as someone that, makes strong decisions, knows a whole lot, and is just kind and believes in the people she works with. Yeah.
I love that. I love the character, and I love the utilization of the trope, because that's something very common. I mean, in narrative in general, right? The mentor, the trustworthy, wise mentor character, the old Ben Kenobi kind of person. But specifically in video games, there's something intrinsic to what it is, where there's a learning curve, right? That a game has a tutorial, and different games experiment with different ways to do that tutorial. But mostly, usually, or commonly at least, involves a character that the game just communicates to you that you are intended to trust from the jump, right? Like, this is your commanding officer. This is your mom, right? If you play Pokemon, here's Professor Oak. He's going to tell you what to do. Trust him. We don't have an hour in this game to build that relationship. So we have to utilize that kind of tutorial style thing. So the way that you guys lean into that in a language that not everybody speaks. If you don't play games in that way, you don't necessarily understand those tropes,
Right.
but it carries so much information. When all that happens, the very first time, at least in the demo that I saw, the very first thing that you experience is you are standing there talking to Redbraid. And that's kind of all that's needed, because it's a video game, and you know that the first character is the one that's going to teach you how to play the game. You can trust them.
Right. Yeah. And I think the other thing that adds to that trust is that, so another, we also model, sort of vulnerability and apologies in that too. So actually also at the beginning of that, Redbraid actually ends up crash landing Ava on a planet. They are in a shipwreck basically when you start the game. There is a point in that very beginning scene where it's about Redbraid apologizing to Ava about, these mistakes that she made, and about, any potential fear or hurt it caused. And I think that that's a really good way to also start off this trustworthy relationship between a mentor and a mentee, because, people are human, they make mistakes, they're not all knowing. And I think that's important to have in a mentor-mentee relationship too.
Absolutely. We have our group supervisions here at Effective Artistry Wednesday morning. So I always come from that into this, and it's always interesting to compare. But that's a lot of what we were focused on today, is that the impact that you have on people is correlated with the impact that you allow other people to have on you. And it's not always one-to-one, and there are other variables and hierarchies and power, but that stuff can get, pretty manipulated. So I appreciate you clarifying that, because it's not, you guys, at least, other video games do often just say, here's the trustable, like, mentor character, just do what they tell you. But that you guys are taking that extra step and saying, okay, we're using this trope so that you know that this person is safe, at least, or at least have enough reason to listen to them. And then based on what they say, you can determine, kind of like you were talking about, how much you trust them or not. Right. So because in real life all the time, what we're looking at is the balance between generalization, people are like this, school is like this, broad terms, broad heuristics, ways of approaching things and what to expect. And then the specificity of this person is a unique person, and this context is unique. So how do we find that right balance? And really, again, part of the video game thing, it's not just the trope, it's the safety in risk taking. Let me try this, because if I die, it's a video game. Not that you die in Social Cipher.
You can. So in Social Cipher, in Ava, the reason that, so we do have these role-playing elements, right, with all these this branching dialogue, but we also are a 2D platformer. And we spent a lot of time working with neurodivergent youth to make sure that it's fun, it's accessible at multiple levels, but it's still challenging. And we wanted to kind of create this sort of dual stream of learning and of safety and also iteration, right? Where you can, if you feel more comfortable in the 2D platforming arena and you're doing really well in that, it helps you feel a little bit more confident in the dialogue area, and vice versa. If you're feeling more confident in the dialogue area, but when it comes to physical 2D platforming, you're not doing so great, there are ways to kind of practice and build on those skills and build on that resilience, and kind of get over that fear of failure in sort of both of those areas. And I think that it's important to pair both that physical gameplay and more of the mental, emotional element together to create the most effective of people feeling proud of themselves when they get over challenges, whichever camp those challenges might fall in within the game.
Vanessa, something that I've learned about our teenagers that are really drawn to the idea of using video games as a learning modality is that instant feedback, right? Like you learn a new skill, you master it, you level up, and then you learn a new skill, you master it, then you level up. And then as you go, the quests get more and more complex, where in the real world, or in this setting that we've let on into it, but there's not that immediate feedback. Can you talk a little bit about how Social Cipher sort of gives that feedback to individuals? And I mean, how does it get more complex? And then thus, how does it translate into their day-to-day interactions with human beings?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is so as the quests go on for trust, they get a little bit more and more complex and sort of build on the previous learnings and do callbacks. And so, for example, with this first trust episode, it's the first one is with this character called Ramen Bot. Brandon and I went through that one, and it's really just about helping Ramen Bot apologize to a coworker. And also gaining another person's trust when you don't have any, and realizing that, that's trust building is a thing that you have to do with someone. But then in the next one, you've kind of also through a curriculum, right? You've defined what trust means to you, how to build it, but what about detecting it in someone else and whether someone else is a trustworthy person? So then on the next quest, it's all about working with someone and realizing that they may not be the most trustworthy person, despite having a great reputation and seeming like a really cool person, and like discovering and seeing these nuances and making the decision of whether to advocate for yourself and put yourself first there or not. And then you get to that third quest with Lior, where it is all about, all right, well, I now know what it is to kind of feel that, to build that trust with someone and what good trust feels like. I know what someone untrustworthy feels like. How do I put sort of these two values together that I've learned about and discussed with my counselor teacher? And how do I bring that into, someone that seems a little more ambiguous, where, maybe they could be great, maybe they couldn't, but I don't know because I don't even know how to really communicate with them yet. So that one is really about getting to that point and then applying both of those two values that you've been discovering. And so we kind of go deeper and deeper with each quest. And in our curriculum, a lot of it is about not only, it's about discussing and expressing, whichever way you would want to, what trust means to you from the beginning, then, analyzing that through the context of the game. And then at the very end, a lot of our curriculum is really around applying it to real life situations. So in what situations have you felt trust? In what situations have you felt that someone was untrustworthy? What did that feel like? What were the sort of indicators of that? And kind of sort of in a way, like quizzing players on that in a more conversational setting and talking about different situations that they've gone through.
I want to go into trust and all this. But real quick, I want to remind chat that part of the reason that we have awesome guests like Vanessa coming on this year is so that you can ask questions of people that have information that we don't have. So please feel free to jump in, as much as I love the conversation. But yeah, no, when you're talking about trust, and I love that you chose that for your first episode, I find that with neurodivergent people, I do a lot of psychoeducation, talking, meta communication, right? Talking about how the brain works, giving information rather than being directive, because we, for one reason or another, have a lot of experiences of here's the normative way and it doesn't work for me. Mm-hmm. So needing to put a lot of effort into letting go of right and wrong, because that's a lot of what normative is, right? Like, this is the right way to do it. You make a list and break it down. This is the right way to do it. When somebody says, how are you? You say, I'm good. How are you? You don't answer honestly, whatever. There's right and wrong. So we have to get away from that and just show options. This is what can happen. And you have to feel safe to be able to explore those things. So I talk about trust as, I think there's two subcategories of it in our language that neurodivergent people in language. One is safety. Trust, is you're not going to hurt me. I guess the worst would be you are going to harm me, and the best would be you are going to protect me from all harm. And there's a lot of whatever in the middle. The other side of trust, I think, is very helpful to talk about as existing on the opposite end of the spectrum from understanding, in terms of, will I listen to what you're telling me and allow it to impact me? If you give me advice, tell me to do something, will I do it? The more I trust you, the less I need to understand how you have arrived at the conclusion that I should do this thing. The less I trust you, the more questions I'm going to have. Why? Why should I do it that way? Which is a trait that a lot of neurodivergent people share and have trouble with, especially in the school system and academic settings, because it gets viewed as questioning authority. And it's like, no, I'm not against it. I just need to know why. So I don't know. I always like to use this example of, imagine that someone busts into the room that you're sitting in and says, no time to talk, we got to go, grab your phone. How many questions would you have for that person before you agree to leave? And it changes depending. If it's my wife, I'm like, cool, we're out of here. If it's a friend, I'm going to probably be like, what's going on? If it's a stranger, I'm going to have a lot of questions, starting with, who are you and how did you get in here? So again, to be able to use this language, those tropes, to be able to communicate as like kind of a baseline. And I love that it's individualized. It's paired, you mentioned briefly there, but just to call out in case anyone missed it, that the game is paired with a curriculum that comes along with it, so that it's not, here is what trust is and the right way to do it. It's a conversation and an exploration of what is trust to you, and you can test some things out and see what happens.
Precisely.
We have some quick questions in the chat and some comments. Vanessa, what age range is this game aimed at?
Yeah, so it is aimed at ages 10 to 15, so middle school to high school. There is a little wiggle room on each side. We've had people as old as, me, like in their early to mid 20s, who've really enjoyed it. And we've also had, younger folks, ages like 7 or 8 year olds, really enjoy it. But really baseline, like reading level, is more at sort of the middle school level. So that's where we typically take it.
And like Brandon had mentioned, there's a curriculum that goes into it. If a parent's interested, is this for them, or is it more for a setting like in a school or with therapy?
I would stay tuned for that, because we're figuring out how to release a parent model. We've had a lot of parent interest of, really dedicated, engaged parents who want to be able to have these conversations with their children. And so we are coming out with one. I would stay tuned and just get on our newsletter. And we should be coming up with some kind of wait list or something for that very soon.
Wonderful. And another question is, what if any specific experience of yours or other people on your team informs some of the things that you included in the game?
Oh, yeah. So, I think one of the most prominent ones, and this is something that you can see where can you see it? I do a talk actually for Games for Change where I actually do show this part of the game, but I'll try to explain it as well as possible. So, in a typical 2D platformer, typically you have, if you imagine something like Super Mario Brothers, right? Like you have hearts, and once those hearts or lives go out, you die. And for us, I wanted to be able to change that a little bit and make it more relevant to the neurodivergent community. And so for me, I was like, all right, so what is quote unquote death, or quote unquote, like, some sort of ending for me? And for me, that's sensory overload and shutdown. And so the way that I actually figured that out and started to become more in tune with my own sensory processing problems was that we had to figure out a way to display this in the game. And so I would actually go into crowds. This was before COVID, but I would go into crowds and I would, maybe not the best idea, but I would go and subject myself to just how this all felt. Like how I had never paid attention to what I was feeling and the thoughts I was having during my times of sensory overload. They just happened and I melted down. And by writing down like how I felt, what was going on in my head during that time, we were able to translate that into some awesome animations, so that when Ava runs out of lives, she actually goes into shutdown, and there's an entire anxiety sequence where she has to ask for certain types of help in order to get to where she wants to be again and restore herself. And the best part of that is that we've had so many youth that have played the game, and we knew we got it right when all of them were just like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what happens to me. I've never seen this. Like I feel so seen. And those are the kinds of things that really make me feel so connected with these players and with the community, and that we continue to try to do in terms of our experiences.
That's wonderful. And we have a commenter in the stream that brought up an interesting question. You know, we only know the perspective of our own individual, you know, realities. Would this game or platform be helpful for people that are trying to understand the experience of somebody with autism or other neurodivergent?
Most definitely. So we did pilots in the beginning of the year with 12 fantastic schools and centers over 6 weeks to use our product, use our curriculum, our remote streaming app platform, which we call the companion app, and our game series, of course. And we actually we had a ratio of about 60% neurodivergent, 40% neurotypical youth. And what we saw in our sort of feedback surveys and calls was that all of the teachers and counselors that were using this were like they were finding value in this game for any of their students, realizing that, you know, it helped the youth that were more neurotypical understand sort of the experiences of autistic people. And we actually got letters. We got so many letters from this awesome school. And it was all these kids writing to us being like, I have social anxiety, or I have a really good friend who's autistic, and I never realized that this is what they experienced. This is how they felt. And even I can relate to some of these things. And it kind of makes me feel seen in some ways. And getting those helped me realize two things. One, that yes, this game can definitely help folks see value and have an understanding of the neurodivergent experience. And number two, I think it also is starting to show that the supports and the extra help that we offer to neurodivergent folks can also be extremely beneficial to the insights and to the understanding of just themselves for neurotypical folks as well. I think that if it's something, a lot of the time, if it's something that helps neurodivergent folks, you'll see that it actually helps the general population as well.
Yeah. Yes, I love that. And I'm going to say something verbally just for people who listen to this as a podcast, that I appreciate that you did air quotes when you said neurotypical.
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably a longer conversation for another time.
Oh, yes.
Of why you did that and why I like it. But when we're talking about identity exploration, this is part of what's unique about video games, and of course the performing arts and drag and tabletop role-playing games and other things like we talked about last week on this stream, where you are the character, but you're not the character. It gives you an opportunity to see what it might be like to be somebody else, to see what it would feel like to be, you know, I love probably my most like formative games were the old BioWare games, starting with Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect and all of those, where they would have morality systems, right? Where you'd get presented with choices. And if you made one, you'd get light side points. If you made other, you get a dark side point. And so many people love playing those games twice through, wants to be as light side as they can and wants to be as dark side as they can.
Yes.
To get the different story beats. And I could talk about how terrible it is to make Zalbar kill his friend. But we're different generation, I think, by like 10 years maybe. So this is, in terms of identity exploration, what video games allow you to do is see what it's like to be in a different context, to see what it's like to be a different person. Part of what I love about doing the work that I do, and I love your story about going into the crowds, we talk all the time about you cannot notice everything, you know, that your brain has pre-conscious processes that dictate what things you notice and what you don't, and it needs reason. There might be right reasons, wrong, you know, like you could be incorrect, but it needs a reason to pay attention. Well, because you're creating this game, now all of a sudden you have a reason to pay attention to what language you might use to describe that experience that you've had many times. So you see something, you get something out of it, you induce it, even though it's miserable, purposely because it has value. Or for me in my work, that part of the reason I'm so weird is many reasons, but is that because I don't know what information might be helpful to my clients or not. So my brain has reason to pay attention to random things that otherwise I would just write off and say have no relevance to me, because it might help a client at some other point, right?
Right.
So video games do the same, to expand your ability to say, I never really thought of conversations as something that need to be like delicately worked through. Or I never thought about the fact that if I say something, that somebody else might interpret it differently than the way I intended it, and then refuse to listen to me when I say that's not what I intended. And when they play your game, they see that that can be an experience. It creates more awareness, gets them to pay attention in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why so many of our counselors and mental health professionals find it so valuable to be able to not just play through this episode of our game once, but also play through it multiple times to just show the different ways that these dialogue systems and these different perspectives can branch. I mean, you can choose to recruit or not recruit whoever you want. You can choose to step back and apologize, or do so many different things, and each one has a really different outcome for you. And I think that understanding just the nuances of the language you use in each of these scenarios and how it changes things really just gives you so much insight, and honestly helps me feel more confident in the way that I interact with people too. And that's what we're aiming for all of our youth, but works for me too. So that's
Vanessa, we have a request in the stream comments. Can you talk a little bit more about this theme of asking for help within a game? Because that's something that we're not all comfortable doing, especially with this narrative of we have to be independent and do everything ourselves.
Yeah. So as I was saying before too, every situation that we come up with. So we have some fantastic educational professionals in our team. We've got a neurodivergent curriculum writer and an autistic psychologist, and they work together to form our curriculum. And the rest, the actual decision on which social emotional themes to work on comes from the youth and professionals that we interview, often like hundreds of them, and we just go directly and ask them, like, if you're a neurodivergent adult, we go and ask, what is something you wish you had learned to be able to do earlier in your life as a neurodivergent person? Or for, professionals, like what are the most difficult topics to really get the message across to, the young folks that you work to, and how can we make that easier? And so that's what all these themes are based on. And one of the biggest ones, along with trust and with self-advocacy, was asking for help. That was huge. And so the way that we kind of do that is we start to introduce it very slowly. So, for example, with Ava's interactions with Redbraid, a lot of it is about, Redbraid may have already told you like quickly how to do something, but you can ask again. And sometimes we actually have you ask again to get more details, because it's just a better way to do it sometimes. And she doesn't have any judgment against you. She's just like, oh yeah, that's totally understandable. I should explain that better, right? And then the other thing that we've done is, like, within the game, especially with the shutdown sequence, it's not just, you have sensory overload, you shut down, and then you wake up. There's actually an entire sequence within where Redbraid's back with you, and she's like, what do you need from me? And it really is up to, there are a bunch of different choices of how you can help, and how you can define what you're feeling. And it really is about asking for what you need. And we have the player ask for what they need as Ava in order to get back into the game, and really kind of ruminate on that. And we're going to have a lot more coming in with that for our next episode. Our next episode is all about trying new things. So that will be a lot more of asking for help and, figuring out, the how will people perceive me if I'm trying this new thing? Will I even like it? Is it even something that's worth my time? All of those things. So that's going to be a continuation of sort of this asking for help element that, honestly, it's such a big topic that I don't think one episode could fit it. I think it's something that needs to just be continuously repeated and woven through our narrative through the entire series. Because it's something that probably took me the longest amount of time to learn, as just both a neurodivergent person and as an entrepreneur too. That took a while, and I'm still learning it.
I love the question, and it's something that you guys are working on. And of course, this is something that you and I talked about when we were talking about my experience of seeing the game, interacting with the game. Because asking for help, like you said, it's a big thing, I would say universally, but I don't know for sure. Definitely in neurodivergent people, it is likely to be something that we struggle with. And I always try to remember and to remind people that asking for help is something that it's a piece of language we use to qualify things arbitrarily. So in other words, what counts as help and what doesn't? Because nobody is able to do anything without help. If I say, did you make your own clothing? Did you grow your own food? Did you build the house that you're in or the computer you're using? Right? We all rely on each other, but we have certain things identified by our culture as this kind of help you're not supposed to need. You're not supposed to ask for. It's you're being a burden, or it displays some weakness or deficiency in you to want help with it. All of that is arbitrary. And especially for neurodivergent people to kind of explore, okay, what are the social consequences if I ask the wrong person for the wrong kind of help? And when we default to safety of, I'll just never express any, inability to do something completely individually. The classic, especially in ADHD, but the classic, oh, don't worry, I'll figure it out. How are you going to do this thing? I'll figure it out. Which just means I have no idea, but I don't want your help. I don't want you to have any reason to believe that I don't have an idea. But if we knew, I'd give you a better answer right now. So that, and again, tutorials or even things like difficulty modes in video games to be able to switch from easy, medium. One of the things that I think is so appealing about video games generally for so many people is that it offloads so much executive functioning work. That if you play a game like WoW or Breath of the Wild or whatever, that it tracks your quests. Who am I supposed to talk to get a quest? Well, the guy with the giant exclamation point hovering over their head. Clear visual communication of data. I talk to them, I get a quest, it puts it into my quest book and onto my screen, and my mini map has a little indicator of where I should go. And when I get there, I know you might know more about this than me, Vanessa, so I'm curious. But to me, it certainly seems that as time goes on, video games do more and more to provide information for the player. Whereas like Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, I don't know if you've played, I'm revealing my age. This is like when I was in middle school. Was this massive open world, and you'd get quests where it'd say like, you got to walk this way for a while until you see this mountain and then turn this way. And I mean, it was so hard to figure out where you're going. And then Elder Scrolls 5 Oblivion, when you get a quest, you got your map marker being like, go exactly here. Because there was this kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase Nintendo hard. Vanessa's referring to back in the days of the original NES, there was no technological ability to save your game state. So a game had to be beatable in one sitting. But if a game was too easy to beat and you could beat it in one sitting, there's no replayability. So the original NES games are very, very hard to beat. And I kind of feel like over time, video game designers and developers have been learning, it's not the difficulty that draws people to this. Let's take the executive functioning stuff off their plate so that they can engage with the part of the game that they enjoy. I don't know. I'm trying to get a response for there.
Well, I mean, Brandon, you're a compendium of video game knowledge, and what we're hearing about today is Social Cipher, a game that's designed with a very specific purpose of helping people, where there's other video games that are designed to be calming. Like I'm thinking about like Animal Crossing or other games in which you're like forming communities. I mean, should we feel bad, Brandon, like when we just want to just go shoot up a place like a Grand Theft Auto or like these super violent games in which we're role playing these characters that are obviously doing things that we don't accept as societal norms for living within a civilization?
I mean, I'm open to whatever anybody else might say, and I'd love to hear your opinion, Vanessa. But to me, of course not. Of course not. Like, should we feel bad when we read a book that has villains in it that do bad things or watch a movie? Like, the whole point of it, the whole point of narrative art, media, is that we can experience things that aren't real. That my son, who loves Star Wars, I'm getting off of video games right now, but he loves in particular the Clone Wars series. And just yesterday we watched, like the people who know this are going to be like, yeah, wow, what a reference. And everyone else can be like, what? Just watch the Umbara sequence, which is it's four episodes in season 4 exploring literally the horrors of war in a child's cartoon You are watching dozens and dozens of characters die, including named characters that you love. At one point, the clones are tricked into killing each other. In fact, Vanessa, by a commanding officer who is telling them to do bad things, basically. And to see that emotion on their faces as the characters are crying. There's a character named Waxer that you've known for seasons who is dying because he was killed by his fellow brothers. And as he's dying, he's crying because, not because he's dying, he says, we were killing our brothers. So I don't ever want my son to have to experience in real life what that is like, to have to learn or experience why fighting is bad, why war is bad. But if we put it in that context, then you can experiment and explore and see in a way that doesn't involve you actually having to experience the pain. That's what we mean when we talk about catharsis.
Right. I absolutely agree with that. I think that my favorite genre of games actually are first-person shooters. And so, I mean, it just gives you a way, and I think especially when they're more narrative-driven, because I do like more of the narrative-driven for first-person shooters, stuff like that. But when they do include, you know, these questions of morality, or at least prompt you to think about these, you know, these situations that you may never be in, but do kind of bring out these questions of what's right and what's wrong and what your stance is on things. I think it helps you apply that to so many other situations in life, and the way that you tackle things that may be on a smaller, less dramatic scale, but help you understand, you know, why you think the way you do, even if you're not consciously doing it and you're young. But I think that exposure to that kind of stuff in a way that is, you know, thoughtful or can beget thought, like I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's helpful.
It gives you reason to pay attention to things you wouldn't otherwise have reason to pay attention to.
Right.
You know, that I will never forget. And of course I say that, and then I don't remember if it was Mass Effect 2 or Mass Effect 3. I can't remember. But I will never forget the moment where it's one of those BioWare games where mostly the options are pretty clear about what's the good guy option and what's the bad guy option. Mm-hmm. But then there's this one moment in this game where there's an enemy species called the Geth, and it's robots, and it's a hive mind. And you're presented with two options. You can either kill them all. You're like accessing into the central computer, kind of whatever, right? You can either kill the entire race of Geth, these like synthoid beings, or you can reprogram them so that they are your allies. They don't get to sign off on it. They don't get to give consent or not. You either kill them or you make them like you. And I sat there for, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm getting the chills right now talking about it. I still think about which of those things do I think is better or worse? Like to forcibly make someone believe and act differently, or to kill them? You know, I guess that says a little bit about what I think about ABA too. Oh yeah, somebody said spoiler. Sorry. No, just all art, all media, and video games. And as much as I respect Roger Ebert, and I do, he famously wrote an essay about video games are not art and cannot be art. His reasoning was because you can redo the story, you can retry. There are no consequences for failure. But he just didn't know enough about what it is. You know, when you think of, Ness, did you ever play Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, the first like 3D version? Prince of Persia is an old 2D scroll. It's the one where they introduced time rewinding, which is actually a pretty common mechanic in video games. It was also a jumping platformer. You try, but then rather than die and reset to the checkpoint, you could just rewind time and try again, rewind time and try again. And that mechanic does not take away from the art of the experience, the ability to be impacted by something. So yeah, of course, and just to be clear and say this, because there might be people still wondering about this because of media coverage, playing violent video games does not have a deleterious effect on a person in any way, shape, or form. Are there correlations between people who are violent and people who play violent? Maybe, but you know, there are people who are violent that drink coffee. So we don't say that drinking coffee makes you violent. Yeah, so just, of course, explore and experiment and discuss, especially parents and kids. I don't know how this piece of advice got lost, but back in the day when I was young, they always used to say, watch watch the shows your kids watched, which I hated because my mom would always watch the worst episode of something and then judge the whole series on it. Play games with your kids. You want to know somebody better? Do what they're interested in.
Yeah.
Play games with them. Find out. Explore. I'll shut up now. I'm just passionate about video games, and I want to hear more from you guys. Or actually, we got to start wrapping up, don't we?
It's been about an hour now. I mean, Vanessa, one more plug for Social Cipher. Tell us when we're going to be able to find it, where we're going to be able to find it, how can we access it, all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you can find out more about us on socialciphergame.com, Cipher with an I. If you click the Get the Game button, it'll give you a lot more information on, pricing, all of that stuff. Right now, we're selling mostly to, mental health professionals, schools, teachers, counselors, anyone in between that works with neurodivergent youth. But we are thinking of having a parent model come out soon. So if you want to stay tuned on that, you can sign up for our newsletter at the bottom of the webpage, on the homepage, learn more about us on that. We're also pretty active on Twitter, and that's at Social Cipher. But yeah, that's most of where we are. And we'd love for you all to, follow up with us and ask us your questions and, engage with us. That'd be awesome.
Well, thanks so much for being here, Vanessa. It's wonderful learning about this useful tool, this game that's engaging for young people to really explore what it means to be autistic and practice the skills of existing in this world. And Brandon, thank you again for being our host and engaging in such a wonderful conversation. Thank you to all the audience members for joining us this week. Next week, we'll be back with another episode in season 2, featuring another guest. And so feel free to come back and check us back out for another new topic, same links, same time. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks so much.